Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the podcast, I'm sharing a recording of a recent AOP webinar. We welcome back friends of the pod Daniel Dorr and Laura Noonan of Supplier IO, and they're joined Alexandra Di Fabrizio from Impak Analytics to discuss the findings of over 200 in-depth ESG risk assessments that provides an unparalleled look into the current risks of supplier sustainability performance. Now, during our discussion, which I co-hosted with Kelly, we break down the highest risk areas associated with ESG, share some mitigation best practices, and elaborate on the opportunities that procurement has to strengthen their role in the business of neutralizing ESG-related risk. All of this based on analysis of real-world ESG risk assessments. So let's go straight into the conversation where I ask Laura if she found procurement or if procurement found her.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to say a little bit more that procurement found me. The reason is I actually have started my career in environmental, social, and governance management, right? So looking at carbon accounting, carbon analytics, but certainly as part of that, in a key area that we focus on is the supply chain, and with that, of course, procurement. So came in from really more of an ESG carbon analytics perspective, but have really worked closely with procurement as a result of that. So looking forward to the discussion today.
And procurement is playing an ever-increasing kind of role in that as well.
Absolutely.
I imagine that you see that, and that's one of the reasons why procurement's becoming a larger part of who you work with.
That's for sure. Yep.
And Alexandra, same question to you as well. How did you get involved in procurement space?
Yeah, for sure. So procurement definitely found me in this case as well. So I work for Impak Analytics, which specializes in ESG and impact assessments for mostly financial institutions, investors, corporations. So our clients really factor in our evaluations and the risk analysis of their investment portfolios, and increasingly for assessing suppliers on ESG factors. So it's only really when we went into that second area that procurement started to find me. I mostly work as an analyst, though. My subject matter expertise is in oil and gas, energy companies, corporate impacts, and we really focus on double materiality, but increasingly we're doing this risk discovery and impact analysis of value chains and supply chains. So I'm slowly getting closer and closer to procurement, including with events like this. So
well, I look forward to tapping into both of your experience and expertise in this space. And Daniel, welcome back. We're happy to have you back to really. When we join and when we work with Supplier, we're often going into research and having research-based conversations, which is really interesting because it gives us some data to baseline and benchmark, tripping up of myself, against, which is something that we really like as procurement leaders. I just wonder if, kind of to kick things off, you can just tell us a little bit about the objectives of the Supplier ESG risk research and the report that you have pulled together.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. So excited to be here and to be partnering with Alexandra and Laura on this content, both environmental folks and also data nerds, which is awesome. We love that here at Supplier IO. And you're absolutely right. So we've heard a lot of conversations around procurement the last few years about regulations and how important it is. And we've all been watching those regulations come and go, and maybe they include scope 3 and maybe they don't. And are they coming this month or next year or whenever? So it's been a lot of sort of looking and waiting and trying to figure out what the tea leaves are going to tell us about the importance of sustainability. We felt like what we were missing was the data. Like, the reason there are regulations and the reason we're doing this is to help us better manage our supply chains, to reduce risk, and to identify challenges. And so we felt like the way to do that was to partner with an organization like Impak Analytics and Alexandra, and let's actually go get data and let's find out how much risk are we really taking in our supply chains. Is this a big concern, or is this, kind of a tempest in a teacup kind of thing? And if it is a big concern, where specifically should organizations be focused? Again, we love bringing data to the conversation. cut through all the hyperbole and the noise and get some clarity. And so that was the goal of this report, was to actually analyze over 200 companies and look at where the risk really sat. And also, by the way, because we love good news as well, not only where there's challenges, but where people are successfully mitigating those challenges as well. So that was why we did this. Let's bring data front and center and make better decisions.
Well, we did a slightly less rigorous piece of research before today's AOP Live webinar. We asked a question on LinkedIn, as we always do. We always ask a LinkedIn poll in advance of our webinars, just to kind of get a little bit of the pulse of the AOP community. And so the question we asked, I'm going to read this out just for anybody who may listen to this rather than me watching the video later. We asked a question: which part of your company's ESG program do you work most closely with your suppliers to achieve? And so in order of results, we have sustainability and emissions top at 57%, regulatory compliance was second at 26%, and diversity, equity, and inclusion was 17%. And we only gave 3 options on that poll. So sustainability first, regulatory compliance second, and DEI third. Now, I will ask kind of around the table, and Laura, let me ask you first, put you on the spot. What were your thoughts when you saw these results?
Yeah, not surprised at all. I mean, every company today is really having to address and deal with climate change and really address emissions specifically in their supply chain. And so about 80% of a company's emissions, overall greenhouse gas emissions are in and can be found in the supply chain. And so the ability to be able to reduce those emissions, whether you're working on reaching a science-based target commitment that your company has, or just trying to lower overall emissions, the only way to do that for most companies is to be working very closely with their supply chain and to be figuring out ways in which to reduce those emissions. And so that is, in addition, it's connected very much to number 2, where the regulatory compliance, there are many new regulations as it relates to greenhouse gas emissions. So it doesn't surprise me at all. We talk to companies every day that are dealing with and trying to figure out ways to address this.
Alexandra, anything else to add on top of Laura, or really just echoing some of Laura's thoughts on seeing that result?
Yeah, so I completely agree with her. What I would add is just to say it's essential for companies to engage their suppliers when they're calculating their scope 3 emissions. So when she was talking about calculating GHG emissions for the corporate, well, it's important that they get detailed measurements from their supply chain of their own emissions so that they can calculate their scope 3. And scope 3 emissions calculations are becoming more and more stringent and are becoming more and more required by regulation. But as we know right now, we're still at more scope 1 and 2 as a requirement, but it's happening more and more. So it makes sense that the ESG programs are looking at emissions mostly, but then we also have that umbrella term of sustainability. So I do think that maybe it might have been an easy click, because sustainability really does encompass all of the options. But that's not a bad thing, because at least we might be looking at further than just emissions for a lot of the people that selected this, which would be great. As we'll see throughout the report, there are greater risks than just GHG emissions.
But I think, Philip, the other thing that I think this also demonstrates is that organizations are not responding to regulations. This is not regulatory driven, where people are saying, oh, we have to respond to regulations. That's our biggest priority. How do we do that? What we're seeing is companies have made the decision that they believe being more sustainable is good business. And therefore, that is the number 1 priority. Now, the question is, should diversity, equity, inclusion be the third? We're going to look at the data and find out how much risk there may be in your supply chain to answer that question in a few minutes.
Yeah, and Kelly as well, when I looked at this question that you posed, my immediate thought went to regulatory compliance. So I was actually both surprised and heartened with the fact that wasn't driving, kind of the driving factor. That's not companies just doing it because they feel they have to. Is like, what did you take away from these responses, Kelly?
I think I also took a really positive feeling away from that. One of the things that we've seen over the last few years is that, as everything ebbs and flows, the companies with the most successful, most sustainable programs, not necessarily in the environmental sense, but in the long-term duration sense, are the ones that take any of these programs, and I would include risk management in that, and completely integrate it with their business objectives, with their procurement processes. You cannot long-term manage these things as sort of special projects. It needs to become part of how you work, part of the information that you provide, and part of a basis for every single decision. So I would completely agree with what Daniel shared. The fact that regulatory compliance is not driving these investments and these partnerships with suppliers is actually a great sign, both for procurement's ability to absorb them and also for the likely business outcomes.
So let's move on to some conversation around the ESG risk assessments in question themselves. And Laura, when you look at those ESG risk assessments, what commonalities did you see?
Yeah, great question. So, I think that what companies have to get comfortable with is that every one of your suppliers or every company has risk. You're going to find negative impacts when you start to look across companies. Your own company has them, and that's just the nature of our operations of doing business. Of course, certain companies in certain industries or sectors, those are going to be potentially higher, especially in the environmental sector, environmental, risk areas, such as climate change, which we just talked about, or pollution, maybe biodiversity. And so I think the key there is that, you need to understand that there is risk in your supply chain. And so that transparency, and we're going to show you in a little bit, like what that risk looks like across these 200 assessments. The second thing is that most companies today that do have risk are doing some sort of mitigation, some level of mitigation. And that could be anything from starting to use renewable energy resources, or looking to do some things within their health and safety areas of managing their workers. And so there are mitigation efforts in place. And one of the key things that companies need to really look at, and that you need to look at, are what are those mitigation and how deep are those mitigation strategies that companies have in place. Because again, everyone has risk. So how strong that mitigation strategy is will be important as you look at that risk. And then the last thing, and things that an assessment like these can look at, is that there's positive contributions as well. So your suppliers are doing some things that have very positive outlook, and they're doing things which can actually contribute. Sustainable materials they might be invested in. There are a number of things that they can be doing which can contribute to the positive contributions to any of, let's say, the UN Sustainability Development Goals, or any of the goals that you have that you're focused on attaining. And so those percentages are a little lower. There's higher risk than there is positive contributions, but this type of assessment allows you to kind of look at that and pull those pieces out. And so those are some of the commonalities that we found across the assessments.
Do you find that or should I say, you talked about the fact that there's different risk tolerances in different organizations. What are the kind of things that drive the risk tolerance or risk appetite of, one particular organization versus another?
Yeah, well, I think, and I'll have Alexandra can jump in on this too, but I think that sector and the industry you're in is one of the most important things, right? So if you're in a manufacturing environment, oil and gas, areas where you have high environmental output, you're going to have a higher tolerance for that risk. And you're going to understand that based on the actual sector that you're in, there's different kind of criteria or ways to look at risk. What is material based on that industry? And so some of the things that we're able to look at is, what is that tolerance? What is that risk by sector? And so that's critical in terms of being able to address risk in your supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if we want to go more into detail, there's also geographical location, how widespread your operations are internationally. You're also looking at business models. Certain business models are really set up so that they can sort of lay off the most risk as possible to other players in their value chain. So we look at a bunch of them, but for this assessment, like Laura said, we really did go more industry-based, focusing on extractive industries, but also non-extractive industries to get a nice mix of companies there.
So, Alexandra, when you look at some of this data, but also from your own kind of personal experience, what kind of supplier practices seem to be the greatest source of ESG risks or uncertainty?
Yeah, so for sure. So like I said, we'll really take this as the mix because every industry is different. But
Mm-hmm.
research does show that supply chains account for around 70 to 90% of a company's negative impact.
Yeah.
So since this is happening, it's a great question, and what supplier practices really do carry the most risk for these customers, right? So the first thing that comes to mind is climate risks. So everyone answered right in that first survey. With more and more investors pushing for full disclosure of climatic impacts, like I said, the importance of measuring scope 3 emissions is really rising. So scope 3 emissions are often misreported due to the complicated nature of collecting all 15 categories. So anyone who's been in emissions reporting, I'm sure they have a headache with the 15 categories of scope 3. And companies are really relying heavily on questionnaires to collect emissions data from suppliers to include them into their own scope 3 calculations. And when suppliers demonstrate significantly more emissions than others offering similar products or services, customers understandably view the supplier as riskier relative to others that are contributing more to their carbon footprint. So we see a rise in companies requiring that their suppliers have systems in place to mitigate emissions, such as environmental management systems or other energy efficiency measures, any initiatives that contribute to the energy transition as well. And the climate risk really doesn't just end with emissions. We also have physical risks of climate change, so such as increased temperature, flooding. Anyone on the East Coast knows the risk of flooding right now. And these carry operational risks for suppliers. So customers really need to know that suppliers are implementing mitigation measures to ensure operational continuity despite increasingly severe weather events. So that's sort of the environmental side. Another supplier practice that carries high risk for customers is anything that can affect the reputation of the customer. So this goes with a bit more of that second option, the regulatory compliance. So this could manifest itself in fines for environmental pollution or breaches of emissions limits, which we see quite a bit. And whatever happens along the supply chain will end up showing up on the corporation's, cheat sheet when there's ESG assessments being done. So that matters. Opaque upstream supply chains tend to carry a bit more reputational risk. Poor human rights practices in the supply chain, such as forced labor, also a risk. So that's more of a mix of social, environmental, bit of regulatory compliance in there. And then the last one, of course, is just the grandfather of ESG, ethics and compliance, still plays an important role due to obviously a stronger regulatory and financial risks associated with unethical business practices. So we're really just talking basic corruption, tax evasion, and all that good stuff is the last supplier practice, at least. But we'll go through a lot more other ones, but those are the three main for now.
Okay. And I don't want to follow up on those yet, because let's say we're going to talk about those a little bit in a little while. But one follow up I did have was, you talked right at the beginning about how you're engaging a lot with finance professionals around the topic of ESG. Also, that that funding and investment decisions and things like that are more increasingly being driven by at least ESG, and ESG metrics are a part of that decision making. So I just wonder if you could share kind of behind the curtain of conversations with finance a little bit about what finance is concerned about when it comes to ESG, because I think that's then is a very good driver for procurement, and understanding what procurement can kind of do to help facilitate what the outcomes of those conversations are with finance.
Yeah, exactly. So like I said, I work for Impak, and our main clients have mostly been in the finance sector.
Yeah.
So ESG assessments, our ESG assessments, are integrated into the overall credit risk process. And we're helping these financial institutions evaluate the long-term viability and sustainability of potential investments, and also actual investments. So it allows these credit risk analysts to not only choose potential investments based on these ESG assessments that they're receiving from us. So it's driving capital into the more impactful, positively impactful enterprises. Not only that, but it's also serving as a tool for these credit risk analysts to engage with their major investment clients to say, well, listen, there's all sorts of risk here. What are you guys doing this year to mitigate it? And we're talking really large banks with huge shares in these corporations. So we're seeing a nice shift on the finance side too. And for procurement, understanding this approach can be incredibly beneficial. So just as finance teams use ESG assessments to mitigate credit risk, procurement teams can use similar assessments to manage supply chain risks. So in finance, integrating ESG factors is not just about avoiding risks too, but also identifying opportunities for the value chain. So procurement could adopt this mindset as well by selecting suppliers that align with the ESG values of their company. This could potentially lead to stronger partnerships, innovation, enhanced brand reputation, which is becoming bigger and bigger in the market environment that we're seeing. And finally, by aligning procurement practices with the ESG considerations used in finance, you can ensure a more consistent and holistic approach across the organization, right? So if you have more communication between departments and more informed decision making, the entire business risk management framework from finance to procurement will be a lot stronger. And we're all about mitigating risks, whether they're business risks, impact risks. So yeah, I think that it's an increasingly big topic in finance, and it's definitely trickling down throughout corporations, and procurement can benefit from it as well.
Yeah, when you talk about credit risk decisions being made, then that's a quick fire way to get the attention of the CFO.
That's
I would
right.
imagine.
Yeah, and
Well, and I think. Oh,
just
sorry,
to
go
add
ahead,
to
Laura.
that, no, that's okay. Just to add to that, it's whether you might get a certain level of credit as well, but then it's what's the cost of that credit,
Right.
Because there is much higher cost of capital if your risk is higher. And so companies and CFOs and CEOs look at this. And so the more that risk can be lowered, and of course, as we just talked about, supply chain has such a high percentage, then that helps not only your risk and your supply chain continuity and things like that, but it also has a strong impact on the financial health of the company.
Yeah, and I think, Philip, we've been on this journey for the last few years. As procurement professionals, as getting our seat at the table, and now more and more being involved with CEO and board level discussions. And so, while the data is the kind of data that the bankers and the CFO care about, we as procurement professionals need that level of rigor to be able to go in and have exactly that conversation Laura just articulated. How does procurement help the company mitigate risk, add more value, reduce the cost of capital? Those are board level discussions that many of our procurement professionals are now being asked to have. And so, while the model comes from a finance background, hopefully our goal is to prepare many of you to be able to have these conversations really with your board. Great if you can test it with your CFO, but really we want to make sure that you're comfortable and confident next time you get called into a board meeting, or invite yourself to a board meeting to be able to bring these kinds of conversations to their attention.
And I've got one last question, Laura, for you before I transition over to Kelly to actually start digging into some of these results. But Alexandra mentioned about, we need to make sure that suppliers are doing what they need to do and what they tell us that they're doing. Is that something that you see organizations manage through supplier performance management programs, or do we need to go deeper than that?
I think that, there's so many, I think many people are managing it through supplier management programs and performance programs. The question really is a matter of degree and a matter of the level of depth and breadth that's in that program, right? As we talked a little bit before about what's really material, it's going to be different for different suppliers. And so thinking about a segmentation approach is going to be significant and important in order to think about not only who has the highest risk, but being able to look at that from a segment perspective, a sector perspective. In addition, I think that many companies don't look or have a depth of ESG, and they might look at more self-reported data or data where, again, they're not able to get the full scope of ESG aspects covered. And so I think that companies need to really look and ensure that that is embedded in the degree that it needs to be, that they're getting full transparency. If they're not getting transparency, then it's really not a high level performance management, because you're not able to see where those risks are. Mm-hmm. And so I always say that, like, the thing that I think can be really helpful and can really arm you is going in and having a conversation with a supplier to manage that performance with data in hand, right? So you've already done an analysis, you know where the risk is, you know if they're doing some mitigation activities already, and you can talk about those, you can expand those, you can work with incentives to help them to improve those. You can also see what proactive things they have going on, in addition to extending those as well. So I think the ability, it's a matter of degree, and it's a matter of breadth, I think, in terms of how you're covering the right issues, the material issues for that specific supplier. What kind of segmentation approach are you using, and is that right? And then how do you come in with data to have conversations which allow you to really kind of have meaningful conversations to address the risk? So I think that, as long as the program has that, and has that at a level that hits a large percentage of maybe your spend, then you're going to be in a good position to have a really good performance management.
So drive change if you need
together. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And actually, Laura, to that point of data in hand, just as much as it's important for procurement to have that information about those specific suppliers, it's also good to baseline current practices. And so as much as we're sort of talking about some of the highlights and sort of the key takeaways from the study, we also want to make sure everybody knows we've actually got the entire report linked at the top of the chat. Yeah. Don't start reading it now, save it for later. But that's up there if you want to download a copy, because having that information in hand for many organizations is the first but most important step on this journey towards strengthened ESG risk assessment and then, of course, mitigation. Now, Alexandra, we've talked about the enormity of the umbrella of all the things that are under ESG. And we've talked a lot so far about environmental risk, but I want to dig into some of the specific assessment findings, maybe in a couple of the other areas as well. And as we maybe jump past the E for a second to focus on S, one of the things that's a great reminder for procurement is that we hear S and instantly think, supplier diversity. But there's a lot of other things included in there as well. Certainly we talked about things like modern slavery or forced labor, but there's also traditional worker safety is often included in the S of ESG. So can you talk about some of the specific risk-related findings related to that social portion of the assessments that you did?
For sure. Thanks, Kelly. So just as a quick reminder, the assessment was based on 214 U.S. companies across 11 industries. So we used a double materiality approach. So every time that I name a risk, we're really viewing it as, we considered it as a risk from both the financial side of things, so the risk of the impact on the company's financial standing, sorry about that, and also the impact risk, so the risk that the natural environment and society faced from the company. So all of these risks are double materiality risks, which are increasingly being demanded in reporting regulations in Europe. So we'll see it come to North America in a couple of years, hopefully. So like you said, environmental risks will jump right over into the social risks. You had touched briefly on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I want to touch on it again because it does take the top spot as the risk, the social risk that most companies are exposed to, with 71% of the companies in our 214 company sample. So why would it be this material? Mostly for operational inefficiencies and missed innovation opportunities that can arise from a homogeneous supplier base. This homogeneous base might be a bit less resilient to disruptions and lacking alternative sourcing options that other diverse suppliers can provide. Another one we think of in supply chains, like you said, modern slavery. So we call it just more of an umbrella term of poor labor and working conditions, affecting in our assessment around 45% of companies. So not just forced labor, but also, let's say, migrant workers, things like, especially when you're talking about oil and gas industry or certain geographical areas. And poor working conditions could lead to labor unrest, strikes, boycotts, and that's where we really see the production delays and the shortages, and that's more of our financial risk side of things. And then the more impact risk side of things will also include reputational damage. So obviously reports of forced labor or child labor or other human rights abuses in the supply chain can severely tarnish a company's brand image. And we've seen that over the past 20 years in news media. And we think of S, but then there's also a G here. And G is really big because we include the term supply chain management under governance risks. But it's really supply chain management of ESG under the G. It's a bit confusing, but it did emerge as a significant concern, with 45% of companies facing material exposure to supply chain management risks. And these risks include disruptions from geopolitical events, reliance on single source suppliers, sourcing vulnerabilities, and these are impacting operational continuity, cost efficiency, and regulatory compliance. And then we also had 43% of companies facing risks related to unethical business conduct, and 38% of companies related to anti-competitive practices. And sometimes the G can start looking a bit like an S. So that's why I kind of went into there as well.
Well, and it's interesting with that information you added. I'll hold myself up on this. So many times, you really think about the E and you really think about the S. And then by the time you're getting to the G, you're sort of thinking, well, that's the paperwork that shows I did my job on the E and the S, right? But once you get into this and start really focusing on it in a formal and disciplined and expansive way, there's an awful lot included in that G that goes far beyond thinking about the environment or thinking about social impact. Do you find that even some of the newer regulations and standards around how companies handle data ends up in that G, right? So it's not even the movement of materials or the consumption of supplies, but it's almost like a digital compliance that falls in line with that too. Is that part of what gets included in that G associated risk?
Yeah, exactly. It gets put in there. And I really do believe that like a strong G means that you can put an E and an S on top. I would almost put it like as a G, and then you have ES, and it's really falling on that. With a weak G, you usually don't see any E and S. And immature reporting companies or companies that are just starting off on their ESG journey, you'll see mostly these governance risks being addressed and mitigated, and then we might have really poor mitigation on ENS, but at least we know they're moving somewhere. We'll also see that if your G seems really unmitigated, but then you seem to have all these measures in place for ENS, typically there's something a bit fishy there, and we'll look into it a bit more. You're saying all these things on ENS, but when I go look at your G, you don't have any supply chain management programs. You don't have any management systems whatsoever. You have no measure. You don't have a code of conduct, and it starts to really unravel there when you go into the nitty gritty. And like I said before, I made the joke, it really is like the grandfather of ESG, all of that ethics and compliance stuff. So I think the only reason we don't tend to talk about it is that maybe people are a bit bored, like ethics and compliance started way back in the day. Now we went to ESG. Now we're going to impact. Well, actually, we went to CSR, then ESG, then impact. But that G is really still important. And that's why we still mention it and analyze it, right?
Yeah.
And when we think about the progress of this, I think we all largely agreed that it's good news that straight compliance is not actually driving investments and change in most of these areas, but we can't debate the fact that it does play a role. So when we think about sort of either the general appetite for taking risk or tolerating risk, or the general awareness within a company of how risk plays a role in each decision, did you see in these assessments that there was sort of a correlation between the strength or presence or visibility around regulation associated with risk in an industry and how either mature or aware or focused on that risk companies are, even if it's not driving specific business decisions or driving investment? Did it have a way of increasing the focus that they placed on risk?
Yeah, absolutely. And great question for me, because like I said before, my expertise is really in the oil and gas and energy sectors, which are highly regulated. So industries facing stricter ESG regulations are typically those with a significant impact on the environment, public health, safety, social welfare. So we're really looking at energy industry, chemical and pharmaceutical companies, automotive, transport, and there's also a geographical element that affects the level of regulation as well. But I know that we're just looking industry based for now. So for the risk level managed by companies, in industries with more stringent ESG regulations, companies are generally required to adhere to higher standards related to environmental protection, social responsibility, and also governance practices. And they often include strong compliance measures that mitigate various risks. We're looking mostly at environmental damage, labor disputes, and once again, governance failures. And so as a result, companies in highly regulated industries tend to manage and reduce their overall risk more effectively due to this. And conversely, in industries with less stringent ESG regulations, companies usually face an overall higher risk level due to potential regulatory changes, stakeholder activism, public scrutiny, and the lack of clear regulations can really lead to inconsistent practices, which usually increases exposure to ESG related risks. So we're looking at industries like retail, software, IT, professional services, just to name a few. Yeah.
Now, Laura,
Yeah,
sorry, Alexandra, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to talk on risk awareness, but I don't think you had asked me yet. So
I'll take it though. Because we're definitely transitioning to sort of from awareness to mitigation. So why don't you start us with sort of your thought around awareness, and then I'll go to Laura and we'll learn a little bit about how mitigation can follow that awareness.
Cool. Thanks, Kelly. So for risk awareness, the level of regulation is also positively related to the awareness of risk. So companies operating in industries with stronger ESG regulations are often more aware of the risks associated with their operations. And what we're really seeing is that regulatory requirements are now necessitating more risk assessments, reporting, continuous monitoring. So these regulated industries are like my bread and butter, because I'm getting really nice sustainability reports with thorough monitoring, auditing, and all of that good stuff. And obviously the opposite is true. Industries with fewer ESG regulations, lower awareness of risk, and without regulatory pressure, these companies are not prioritizing ESG issues or recognize their potential long-term impact on sustainability. And this can really lead to a lack of preparedness for emerging risks, like I said, like climate change risks and those physical climate change risks that are emerging quite quickly. And just to finish it off, there's a regulation that's making headway in Europe, and it's affecting transnational American companies as well. It's called the CSDD, and it really helps exemplify this topic. So this regulation is designed to ensure that companies operating in Europe take responsibility for the sustainability of their operations and their entire supply chains. So when this came out, the world was like, what do you mean I have to take care of my whole supply chain? This is impossible. And honestly, this regulation just represents a more standardized approach to ESG across all industries. And that's what we're looking at right now, really all of those industries in Europe, regardless of the current level of regulation. So companies in industries with less stringent ESG regulations will find themselves needing to adapt really quickly to new expectations, while those in more heavily regulated sectors are just going to need to further integrate these practices into their global operations, which will look a lot more seamless than other companies. And the regulations and emphasis on supply chain due diligence means that companies cannot simply focus on their direct operations anymore. They also need to ensure that their suppliers and partners comply with the ESG standards of the regulation. So this is really going to be challenging for industries with complex global supply chains, such as apparel, retail, technology. And the three I just mentioned are also the three that are not very regulated, so that have those risks that it's going to take a lot more. So if you're in any of those industries, this is really a good topic for you. So really this regulation in Europe, which is affecting large American companies, and I'm sure these regulations are going to start showing up soon here as well. It's likely to just create a more level playing field by raising ESG standards across all industries. So hopefully this question of oh, if there's more regulation, are they, do they have more risk, or what's their awareness of risk? It won't exist anymore. Regardless of industry, we're going to reduce the gap between those currently facing stringent regulations and those who have traditionally operated with less oversight.
And given that as we start looking at each one of these regulations, some are more prescriptive than others, right? Some very specifically say you must do X, Y, and Z. Others say reduce your emissions by a certain percent on a graduated timeline, right? Sort of like an EPA type of regulation. Laura, as we think about some of the most effective mitigation practices that you saw and learned about, both through this survey and also through your own direct experience, what are some of the best or the most effective mitigation strategies that you've seen companies roll out at scale?
Sure. So, again, going back to kind of the sector-based approach, many companies, based on what their industry is, are looking at different approaches. But in general, across the assessments that we did, there's some key ones that come up, right? I talked about some of them, but let me go into a little more detail. So, supplier audits and assessments are one of the ones that are just because if you gain transparency, you can start to address and manage the risk. Yeah. And so that was something that we saw across the board, right, as it relates to a way in which you can really look at your suppliers in a deep way and understand what that risk is, and then therefore be able to address it. The other thing is things like looking at practices in addition to the assessments, right? You can also look at certifications. You can start to look at data to support understanding if there are even practices in place. If a company has done something like a CDP climate score or has a B Corp certification, right? These are indicators of practices that are driving towards sustainability. And so evaluating based on, again, the sector, what practices and certifications and potentially positive ratings, or even if there's negative ratings, that's information, allow you to really be able to bring that information together with complete detailed risk assessment. And again, arming you to be able to go talk to a specific supplier, let's say, in order to come up with a plan to improve whatever activities you might have. As part of that, when you're doing that, things like incentives are critically important, because as we didn't talk a lot about this, but maturity of one of your suppliers is going to vary significantly in their ESG maturity. So the ability to work with them on capacity building is the other mitigation strategy. If they're smaller, or if they're mid-size, or if they're in a specialized industry, they may not have the capacity and the resources, right, to be able to address these things. So working with them to build capacity in terms of training, in terms of engagement, it's extremely important. And then if you combine that with incentives, of course, that's critical. That helps them to be able to find those resources that they need. I talked a little bit about the risk-based segmentation. I'll repeat that because it's extremely important in mitigation as an approach, right? And so that came up, in terms of what companies are doing, right? So be sure that you're looking at all the data that we just talked about to be able to think about a strategy where you can make the biggest impact first. So many companies have a risk profile, and then they also are then looking at the actual segmentation. So oftentimes, not for many companies, this is not true, but for many it is, 80% of their spend is with 20% of their suppliers, for example. And therefore, if they were to address the risk with many of those, they're really going to be able to, address the risk and really be able to pinpoint those areas, create the programs, hopefully across those, and make really impacts much quicker, right? So the ability here is to make an impact quicker. So I talked about that. Obviously, many companies, putting and embedding codes of conduct into your supplier contracts is one of the key areas, right? So if you need to make very clear what your expectations are, what your codes of conduct are, so that you have the basic, data and, communication to your suppliers of the expectations of what you as an organization expect, right? And so I think many companies today are doing that. I would ask if you're doing it at the breadth of level of the number of ESG issues that are out there today. And so it's extremely important, happens a lot in the social aspects, but I think we need to look at it across environmental and even in a transparency perspective, that they have requirements for transparency of information, because you can't do any of those governance activities without having, that's a key level of transparency is critical to make that happen. The other area is performance-based contracts, as many of you know, making performance the criteria for which you're going to either select a supplier on, an ESG, environmental, social performance factor, whether that's selecting them on that or whether that is, specific particular contract versus how you might implement that. There's different ways, but essentially making performance a key part of what you're doing. And again, maybe you want to have that with the top 20% of your suppliers, right? Because you're able to influence them, you have the resources to focus on them. It makes the most sense to drive impact faster. And then, of course, as it kind of relates to that, there's supplier diversification. Mm-hmm. And so many companies are diversifying their base, making sure they have, especially with, as Alexandra mentioned, the climate risk that we have today in geographic regions of the world. So if you have production supply coming, if there's geopolitical unrest, any of those things can disrupt your supply chain. So the more that you have backup suppliers and you have a diversification there, you want to make sure that you're able to look at those risk factors and ensure that you have some level of diversification. And then, of course, there's engagement with suppliers. That's the other key mitigation factors. You might overlook that, like, of course, right? But the ability not just to ask for information, but that engagement, that partnership is critical, right? So if you are together working on a goal, if you have a scope 3 emissions goal, and that particular supplier is able to contribute to that through a higher percentage, let's say, of renewable energy, whatever it might be, the ability to really think about how to work with them in that way is extremely important. And then the other area just goes back to public, they're making sure that there's public disclosure and reporting, right? So the more that they can work with these suppliers to make sure that they're publicly reporting and that they are also, integrated into their reporting, right, in a way that makes sense, helps the overall reputation, consumer preference of a company. And so that's more extremely important in areas like retail, and so forth. So Those are some of the key ones that we saw that's, at a very high level. We could get into, right, an environmental climate risk, right, renewable energy, carbon credit support. There's all sorts of very detailed things in the report that you can look at. But across the board, those are some of the key things that we saw.
And if we think about all of those things that have to be accomplished, right? We've talked about transparency and visibility, access to information, connecting that information with the right people at the moment a decision is going to be made. Daniel, I think this really lends itself well to understanding a little bit better where procurement needs to be leveraging digital support when it comes to either understanding levels of risk, monitoring supplier performance, or making sure that mitigation options are available in the moment that a decision is made. When you think about the findings of this research and what's highlighted in the report, where does sort of that digital element come in as a facilitator to make sure that this critical information isn't just gathered and sits, but actually becomes an active part of both strategies and also decision-making?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kelly. If you think about a lot of what Laura talked about there, we're shifting, if you're relatively new to this process and you are in an adversarial relationship with your suppliers, for example, and you may get a low price, but you may be introducing a lot more risk, which means getting the data and the information is a real problem. So we talked a little earlier about surveys, for example. Well, I can just ask my suppliers. Well, if you've been beating your supplier up for the last 10 years to get a low price, how open are they going to be to just voluntarily provide you that information? We've heard repeatedly from suppliers, I don't want to give that information. I feel like it's my competitive sauce. I think you're going to go around me to my suppliers now, and so forth. And so the two ways we address that, number one is that relationship building, is to start managing. And these are things you can do today. You don't even need an entire ESG program. You can start looking at the relationship you have, the transparency, and the contracts. All of that you can start doing today. Doesn't cost you a cent. It's just time and focus. In addition to that, then it becomes the data side, as you said, Kelly, and getting that visibility into the supply chain, through, like, tier 2 reporting, through supplier management platforms and portals, through certification checking and so forth. All obviously stuff that we do here at Supplier, and the ESG risk assessment, similar to what we've had here. So it can't just be one. Like, I'd love to tell you that all you have to do is call Supplier IO and we will solve all these problems for you. That's certainly a part of it, and we help you capture the data and help you figure out where to focus. But it ultimately also is going to come down to the type of relationship you build with your suppliers, and how you build trust in that transparency, so that there are incentives and they do want to continue to work with you, not just because you're going to give them good business, but because you're going to help develop them and grow them as a successful business.
Yeah, no, and that idea of trust is interesting. And Phil, I know we're starting to get close to the top of the hour here, but maybe just to come to you for a second on this idea of trust. Procurement focuses all the time around building relationships, and of course, trust internally, and data and process and experience play a huge role in that. But if we're going to be asking for the kind of information that we are to support ESG associated risk assessment and mitigation, even if it's driven by regulations, we do also need that level of trust with suppliers. So does this then become procurement setting themselves up to build trust internally and externally? Or do you think it can be part of an overall sort of mindset change around how procurement deals with everyone consistently, so that that trust building happens first and foremost, regardless of who we happen to be working with?
Yeah, that's a great point and a great question. I think that the trust is required on both the stakeholder side and the supplier side. So, we're kind of working from both perspectives, but consistency is really important with these suppliers. I think one of the things we talk about a lot is, this idea of when you start building, for example, supplier relationship management programs, and you talk about the fact that it's collaboration, and, we want to look at partnership and bringing innovation. It's not just a cost-based discussion anymore. We talk about that, and then the first time that you get in, a part of the business cycle where you're now looking for, under the cushions for some savings, you go back on your word and you start going back to those same people and asking for cost savings. You're kind of breaking all the trust that you have. We're asking suppliers to entrust us with proprietary information and data. And so if they're not 100% comfortable in doing that, then they're not going to do it, or they're going to find ways to, provide as little depth to the information as possible. Kind of do it so they get a passing check mark, so somebody can't come and tell them that you didn't do this. But the information they provide may not really be 100% accurate or verified, or just not very useful. So there's a bigger picture than just thinking about it in terms of, can we ask our suppliers to provide us with this information? It's the bigger picture is, what's the relationship look like, and the health of the relationship, and how can we make sure that we're a customer of choice for these suppliers? So when we make asks like this, it's a no-brainer for them to want to comply with that request, especially in a non-regulated environment.
Yeah.
And we can, in reports like this and the work that we do, our job is to provide you with the data to ask the right questions, right? So that's what we're here for, right? We want to provide you the data to ask those questions. But you're absolutely right, Philip. If you're not building that kind of trust and building a sustainable supply chain, not just environmentally sustainable, but in terms of managing risk in a long-term supply chain, the data will help target your conversations, but ultimately it won't get you all the answers you need if you're not building those kind of relationships.
And we have, I think, a couple of minutes here. We did have one question that came in from Anna, and it's actually related to stakeholders. And I'm interested in the experience of the team. Laura, maybe I'll position this to you, but feel free to pass as well if you feel it's best answered elsewhere. But the question was, how can we increase involvement and support from stakeholders internally?
Good question. Stakeholders internally. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
really having them because I think from a procurement perspective, often that's where our ESG efforts, it's hard to, you need to get the buy-in internally that these are important.
Sure. It is challenging. And I think executive buy-in is critical, right, for companies to be successful, for procurement teams to be successful. So, it's interesting because CDP just came out with a recent report, supply chain report. And one of the things that they cited was that, that board level commitment, right, is key. And many times they don't know the risk that exists in the supply chain. And so this is a kind of a chicken and the egg thing. So it's a little bit of a challenge, right? But to be able to help them understand the risk that can exist and what that can mean in terms of impact for the company, right? The risks that Alexandra talked about is one of the ways that can help with that, right? So being able to show that risk in such a way across the supply chain, and that could be done in a very high level way with, hey, we need to dig into this, or it could be shown through, hey, this is what other companies are showing, right? Hey, we just showed you 200 companies of real assessments, and there's risk in each one of those companies. So I think the ability to kind of have those conversations can help. I think the other area is really around helping to, showing some short wins, right? So let's look at emissions. That's the biggest focus today. Everyone talked about that. That's a key area. What can we do quickly, right, with some key suppliers, maybe some of the top 2 to 5 to 6 suppliers that are strategic suppliers, to very quickly make inroads and make improvements, right? And so being able to show quick wins and to be able to show and demonstrate that can be then, pushed down further into the supply chain to even, show bigger wins is extremely helpful. And just remember that your company most likely has a scope 3 reduction, goal. And 2030 is coming around where that's the mid time for that for us to look at that, right, from the Paris Agreement. And so being able to bring things that the company's already committed to and to be able to show a quick win and being able to connect those pieces can be very helpful.
Thank you, and Philip, this is an area we've seen a lot of focus on. So I would double down on Laura's comment. A lot of times, because procurement is relatively new to the table in some organizations, they don't know, our stakeholders don't know what questions to ask us or how to engage with us. And so I agree with Laura, be bold and help people understand and reach out and let them know. So we are actually in the final stages of our state of supplier diversity research, where we surveyed over 350 procurement and supplier diversity leaders. And this was a big theme, how to engage with your stakeholders. And what we're finding is more and more procurement professionals in these categories are spending more than half of their time with their business counterparts. Right. So the answer to this is not going to be found in the procurement department. It's reaching out and setting up those meetings. Lots of findings we'll be back to share with you at this point. But I think Laura is absolutely right. Like, reach out and let them know there's risk and you're here to help them manage risk. I would say the flip side we've seen, if you're looking to engage your stakeholders, is, as Laura mentioned, not only like look for a few wins. Don't just highlight the supplier that brought you that win. Highlight the business leader that is driving change at the company and make him or her a hero. Once you get a couple of those, boy, you become very popular. When you start making senior leaders famous for doing good things for the company, you'll get more and more of those stakeholders wanting to work with you.
Well, unfortunately, we have to leave things there. I think there's I wrote down so many comments as we're going through the conversation around lots of mitigation strategies that I'm sure there's a whole lot more of content that we can explore in this, a way to help procurement professionals. But before everybody logs off, I want to first of all remind you that you can download a copy of the report. It's easily done just through the chat. You see it pinned at the top of the chat window. It's Supplier ESG Risk Analysis and Mitigation Strategies. So that's going to kind of cover some of the things we talked about today, going a little bit more depth in some areas as well. So please grab that before you log off. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank you as well, Alexandra. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Daniel, for sharing the benefits of all of your experience and the research that you've done in this topic with our audience. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.